In the city of Erenda, a glassy metropolis surrounded by rolling hills, a peculiar rule governed existence: the more time you spent interacting with another person, the shorter your life became. It wasn't a gradual thing, either. Each interaction chipped away measurable fragments of your lifespan, a process that manifested as faint golden threads floating off your skin and dissolving into the air. The rule wasn't a mystery, it was the balance, an unyielding law of nature. Scientists had studied it, philosophers had debated its meaning, and poets had immortalized it in somber verses. Every Erendian child learned the same lesson early: choose your words and company carefully, for they are the currency of your existence. Kale was a watchman, perched on the city's highest towers, tasked with monitoring the sky for weather changes, wandering animals, and rare incursions from the wild. His job was perfect: he worked alone, with no need to speak to anyone except during the occasional check-in over a static-filled intercom. At 35, Kale was considered young. In Erenda, age wasn't measured in years, but in how much life a person had chosen to spend. Some who lived as hermits had reached 200, while those who craved constant companionship barely made it to 30. Kale had no family, no close friends, no lovers. Not because he didn't want them, but because he couldn't bear the thought of watching his lifespan dwindle for a fleeting connection. Loneliness was his armor and his prison. The red thread. One day, Kale noticed something unusual. A bright red thread streaked across the horizon, shimmering against the twilight sky. It wasn't a weather phenomenon or a trick of the light. It was alive, moving like a serpent through the air, heading straight for the city. Kale grabbed his binoculars, heart racing. As he focused on the thread, he realized it wasn't alone. A figure was suspended in the air, clutching the thread like a lifeline. It was a girl, her hair whipping wildly in the wind. She was heading toward the tower. When she landed, Kale hesitated. Speaking to her would cost him. Touching her could cost him even more. But the girl collapsed at his feet, her face pale and her breath shallow. "Help me," she whispered. Kale couldn't ignore her plea. He knelt beside her and offered his water flask, careful not to touch her hand as she took it. "Who are you?" he asked, keeping his words brief. "Lyra," she rasped. "From the outside." The outside? It was a forbidden land beyond Erenda's walls, where the balance didn't apply. Or so the rumors said. Kale had never believed them. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice sharper than intended. "I didn't choose to come," she replied. "Something dragged me here, the balance, maybe. But it's breaking. The threads are unraveling. Your world is dying." Her words were heavy, but Kale didn't have time to process them. A faint golden shimmer floated from his arm, spiraling into the air. Just talking to her was costing him. "Why should I believe you?" he asked, though doubt gnawed at his tone. Lyra lifted her arm, revealing a strange, pulsing mark on her wrist. It glowed faintly, radiating warmth. "This appeared when I crossed your border. It's connected to your balance. If we don't fix it, you'll lose more than years. You'll lose everything." Kale was torn. Helping her meant more interactions, more words, more time shaved off his life. But if what she said was true, the entire city, perhaps the entire world, was at risk. "You said the threads are breaking," Kale said. "What do we need to do?" Lyra smiled weakly. "We need to mend the balance. Together." Kale reached out, clasping her hand for the first time. He felt the familiar pull, golden threads peeling from his skin. But he didn't pull back. For the first time in years, he realized something: some things were worth the cost. And so, Kale and Lyra set out together, two fragile lives intertwined, their golden threads unraveling with every step. In a world where connection came at a price, they would discover whether saving it was worth everything they had to give. Kale and Lyra journeyed down the spiraling steel stairwell of the watchtower, their silence punctuated by the faint hum of the city below. Every word exchanged felt like a tangible weight, every fleeting glance a reminder of their dwindling time. By the time they reached the base of the tower, Cale's forearms were bare of the golden threads that had once shimmered faintly against his skin. Lyra wasn't faring much better, her cheeks were hollow, her breathing labored. The balance demanded its toll. "You should have left me up there," Cale muttered, his voice heavy with regret. "And let your world collapse?" Lyra snapped, though her voice lacked strength. "No. You'd die alone anyway." The truth of her words stung. Cale didn't respond. As they entered the outskirts of Erenda, the streets stretched wide and lifeless. Buildings loomed like skeletal husks, their windows reflecting an empty world. People shuffled past, avoiding eye contact, their faces drawn and grey. To care too much, to speak too freely, was a death sentence. Even families avoided each other, children were raised in sterile isolation, their parents speaking to them through notes or monitors to preserve their shared time. Cale noticed an old man sitting on a cracked bench, his head tilted toward the sky. The golden glow of his threads was faint, like a candle about to snuff out. A woman hurried by, her threads intact and gleaming. She didn't look at him. "Do they even realize?" Lyra asked softly. "They know," Cale replied. "But knowing doesn't matter. Survival does." Lyra clenched her fists. "This isn't survival. It's slow death." Their destination lay beneath the city, a network of forgotten tunnels that once served as escape routes during ancient wars. According to Lyra, the source of the unraveling balance was buried there, a nexus of tangled threads that needed to be severed or rewoven. But the journey wasn't kind. The air grew colder, the walls damp with condensation. Lyra stumbled frequently, her body weaker than Cale realized. "Stop," she gasped, collapsing onto the ground. Cale hesitated. His own reserves were dangerously low, golden threads leaped steadily from his chest and arms like spilled sand. "You can't stop now," he said, though his voice wavered. "You'll have to leave me," she whispered, her eyes glassy. "You're stronger. You can finish this alone." Cale knelt beside her. "If I leave you here, I'll never make it either. We both know that." Lyra's breath hitched. She turned her head away, as if ashamed. "Then we both die." "Maybe," Cale said. "But at least it'll mean something." They reached the heart of the tunnels, a cavernous chamber pulsating with light. Webs of golden threads crisscrossed the air, writhing like living things. At the center stood a pedestal, atop which rested a glass orb. Inside the orb, the threads knotted and tangled endlessly, glowing faintly red where the balance had begun to break. "This is it," Lyra said weakly, leaning against Cale. Her once vibrant red thread now flickered like a dying ember. "What do we do?" Cale asked. She gestured toward the orb. "The threads need an anchor. A sacrifice. Someone to take the burden and mend the balance." Cale stared at the orb, his chest tightening. "And what happens to the anchor?" "They burn out," Lyra said, her voice barely a whisper. "Completely." Cale turned to her, studying her sunken cheeks and trembling hands. She looked impossibly small, a frail shadow of the person who had crashed into his world. "You planned to be the anchor, didn't you?" She didn't answer, but the shame in her eyes was answer enough. "No," Cale said firmly. "I'll do it." Lyra tried to protest, but her voice cracked, her body too weak to argue. Cale walked toward the orb, his steps deliberate. Every movement seemed to drain more from him, his threads unraveling faster with each step. When he reached the pedestal, he placed his hand on the orb. The thread surged toward him, latching onto his skin, pulling him into the balance itself. The pain was immediate, like fire coursing through his veins, but Cale didn't cry out. He felt his essence dissolve, his very being siphoned into the web of threads, patching the fractures. Behind him, Lyra wept silently, her own thread stabilizing as Kale's life poured into the balance. When the process was complete, the orb glowed a steady gold, the threads no longer writhing but flowing peacefully. Lyra stood alone in the cavern, her hands trembling as she reached for Kale. But he was gone, nothing more than a pile of golden dust on the cold stone floor. The balance had been restored, but Erendir remained the same. The city above carried on, its people still trapped in their solitary lives, unaware of the sacrifice that had saved them. Lyra returned to the surface, her body intact but her soul hollow. She carried the weight of Kale's sacrifice in her heart, knowing that in a world where connection came at such a price, his final act of care was both a gift and a curse. She lived out her days in the city, silent and alone, her golden threads intact but meaningless without the one who had shown her that some things were worth losing everything for.